It was October 2021, the kind of month where the chill seeps into your jacket and fingers even during the daylight. I had just turned 29, and after working through 6 years of contract jobs in Omaha, Nebraska, I decided to take a short break from everything. I had this old, half-rotted plot of land in the Ozarks, something my uncle left me in his will. He died in 2017. Nobody in the family ever used it. It was more of a long-forgotten memory stuck somewhere in Missouri's backwoods. I figured I'd go out there for a week or two. Nothing big, just me, some tools, a used generator, and enough canned food to last 10 days. I wanted to build something small, not a full cabin with plumbing or wiring or any of that. Just 4 walls and a roof. A real back-to-basic kind of project. I packed my old Ford F-150 with lumber, a battery-powered chainsaw, nails, tarps, my sleeping bag, 2 5-gallon water containers, and my old military pack. The drive down took almost 6 hours. By the time I turned off the paved roads and started on the washed-out dirt trail that snaked through the trees, the sky had gone from that dusty gold of late afternoon to a thick, deep gray. I reached the clearing by 5:20 p.m. It was a stretch of open land, maybe the size of a small parking lot. Trees pushed in on all sides, oaks, maples, and a few dead pine trunks half swallowed by vines. You couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction once night came. I stepped out of the truck, stretched my legs, and breathed it in. Damp earth, wet leaves, distant water running. Maybe a stream somewhere to the north. It smelled untouched, like the kind of place no one had walked through in years. Probably because no one had. I didn't waste time. I got to work marking the area. I kept things simple, 12 by 10 feet, about 7 feet high at the tallest point. Just enough for a dry place to sleep and keep gear out of the weather. I didn't bother with a floor. Just cleared the grass and leaf layer with a rake and made sure it was mostly level. The rain started that night around 9 p.m., just as I was heating up a can of chili on a portable burner. Not heavy at first, just a steady tapping on the tarp I'd strung between the truck and a pair of trees. But I knew what it meant. Once it started in the Ozarks this time of year, it could go for days. Mud would become a serious problem. I curled up in my sleeping bag in the bed of the truck and listened. Just the patter of rain, nothing else. That first night, everything felt normal. A little uncomfortable, sure, but peaceful in its own quiet way. The next day, I worked through the drizzle. My jacket kept me mostly dry. I had 2 sets of gloves, both soaked through within a couple hours. I laid out the base frame using 2x6 boards and drove the first nails in with a hammer that had a split in its wooden handle. The noise echoed through the trees, a sharp metallic ring that bounced back at me seconds later. That was the first time I noticed how still the forest was. No wind.
No birds.
No distant rustle of deer or raccoons. Just me and the rain. By late afternoon, the frame was up. I had the vertical studs in place and a partial front wall by sundown. My hands were raw, fingertips swollen from moisture and hammer work. But it felt good to build something with just my hands again. It wasn't until that second night that things started to feel off. Around 1:30 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. Not thunder, not wind, something different. It was sharp, clean, like metal clinking. I stayed still. The rain was heavier now, pouring in sheets off the tarp. But under it, I could hear it again. Clink. Then nothing. I sat up slowly in the bed of the truck and looked out through the plastic window I'd rolled halfway open. Everything was dark. No moonlight, not even a faint glow through the clouds. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just sat there listening. Another minute passed, then crack. A different sound, like a branch breaking but closer than I wanted it to be. I slid out of the truck quietly, boots landing in a cold puddle. I held the flashlight low, covered the beam with my hand, and walked toward the frame of the half-built cabin. I stood there, soaked through, staring out into the black. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a deer, maybe nothing, but I felt it, something watching. It sounds stupid to write it out like that, but it wasn't imagination. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. My jaw clenched without meaning to. I didn't hear anything else for another 10 minutes. I finally went back to the truck, crawled in, and shut the tailgate. I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I tried to brush it off. Lack of sleep, forest noises I wasn't used to, overthinking, that kind of stuff. I got the roof frame up that afternoon, worked till my hands bled from gripping wet tools. By nightfall, I had the whole cabin framed and 2 full walls up. One of the tarps was nailed as a temporary roof. Inside, it was cold, but it was something. That night, it rained harder than I've ever seen. Solid sheets of water, like a faucet left open over the sky. The mud outside was 6 inches deep. My boots made a sucking sound every time I moved. Sometime past midnight, I heard movement again. This time it wasn't a single noise, it was a pattern. Wet footsteps in the mud. Slow, heavy, not animal-like. Just one step, wait, then another. I laid completely still in my sleeping bag, breath held tight. I thought about calling out, but I didn't want to. Something deep in me said, don't do it. The footsteps stopped maybe 20 feet from the truck. Then I heard something dragging. A slow scrape against wood or stone. That's when I realized I'd left the claw hammer stuck in the side of one of the studs. I got out of the truck again, this time with the flashlight on. I clicked it on and scanned the area. Everything was wet. Mud reflected back in streaks. I walked over to the cabin frame. The hammer was gone. I looked down. There were boot prints in the mud that weren't mine. Bigger, wider. Not military or work boots, something else. I followed them about 5 feet until they just disappeared behind the trees. I stayed up the rest of the night, axe in hand, sitting in the corner of the cabin under the tarp. My head spun with thoughts. If it was someone out there, they had no reason to be. No one else had access to the road. I had the only key to the chain lock on the gate a half-mile up the trail. Day 4, I should have left, but something kept me there. I told myself I had to finish the structure. Maybe I was being stupid or stubborn. Maybe I didn't want to admit I felt scared. But I stayed. I worked until evening, put up the final wall, reinforced the roof, covered gaps with plastic sheeting. Inside, it was still crude, but it was shelter. I even rigged a simple door from plywood and a hinge I had lying around. That night, I made a small fire in a metal bucket outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I warmed my hands and watched the flames flicker. The trees creaked. Leaves fluttered in the wet wind. Everything felt too quiet again. Then I heard it. A whistle. Not a tune, just a single sharp blow, like someone calling a dog. I turned around fast. Nothing behind me, but the whistle came again. This time to my left. My heart slammed into my chest like a sledgehammer. I kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed my flashlight and my axe, and backed into the cabin. I closed the makeshift door and jammed a beam through the handle holes. I sat in the dark, waiting. For 2 hours, I heard footsteps outside, circling, coming close, then fading. Twice I heard the whistle again. My flashlight battery died at 2 a.m. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found the door scratched up, not with claws, but with metal, a tool or knife, long, deliberate marks. I was done. I packed what I could into the truck, left most of the food, the tools, everything that wouldn't fit in one trip. Drove out through the mud-soaked trail, tires sliding around every turn. It wasn't until I reached the gate that I saw the chain had been cut. Clean, straight, like with bolt cutters. Whoever had been out there didn't need a key. I haven't been back to the land since. A month later, a sheriff's deputy from the nearby county called me. Apparently, a hunter had reported a small cabin deep in the woods with strange marks and signs of recent use. When they went out there, the place was mostly destroyed. The walls had been torn down, and inside they found the claw hammer I lost, buried halfway into one of the support posts, like someone had slammed it in and left it. Nothing else. No gear. No footprints. No sign of anyone. The deputy told me it was probably just a squatter. But that's not what I believe. Whoever was out there didn't want shelter. They didn't take the food, the tarp, or anything else. They only waited, came at night, watched, took one tool, and left a message I still can't forget. That place wasn't empty, and I'll never go back. My name is Daniel Wright. I was 33 at the time, and it was October 2021 when I decided I needed a serious break from everything. I'd been living in Springfield, Missouri, working 12-hour shifts at a distribution warehouse, and after years of running that loop, it felt like my head was going numb. I had a small apartment just outside the city, no wife, no kids, barely even a social circle anymore. I was burnt out. One Friday night after work, I sat in my car in the parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, just staring through the windshield. I didn't feel anything. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even tired. Just empty. I figured I needed to get out of town for a while and be somewhere quiet where nobody could bother me. No phone, no work, no people, just silence. I remembered this place my uncle took me when I was about 14, a hunting cabin way out in the Ozark National Forest. It had been abandoned even back then. It wasn't even ours. Some relative of his had owned it in the 70s and then disappeared. Not in a mysterious way or anything, just moved off somewhere and left the place behind. My uncle and his buddies used it a couple times, but even he admitted it was too far out for regular use. The more I thought about it, the better it sounded. That old cabin, in the middle of the woods, maybe 30 miles from the nearest gas station, no cell service, no nothing. Just old boards, trees, and air that didn't smell like diesel and sweat. I started looking at maps that night and planning. The next weekend, I packed my old Tacoma with a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food, a propane heater, a little camping stove, water, a battery lantern, and a couple of tarps. I brought a Ruger 10 of 22 just in case something like coyotes got too close, but I wasn't planning to hunt. I just wanted to sit and breathe. Took me close to 5 hours to get out there. After a while, the paved road ended. Then the gravel turned into dirt, and eventually I was crawling through a rutted logging road that probably hadn't seen a truck in 10 years. I had the windows rolled down, and the woods were quiet in that way that makes your skin tingle. Not dead quiet, just real. Birds flitting, dry leaves brushing in the wind, the crunch of tires on pine needles. Felt good at first. Pure. I finally reached the clearing in the late afternoon. The cabin looked about the same as I remembered, though it had aged hard. The roof sagged toward the middle, the chimney had collapsed, and the front porch had all but caved in. A couple windows were boarded up, others broken and open. The wood siding had turned that old gray color that you see in barns left to rot. Still, it was standing. That was enough. I parked a little ways back, under a few oaks, so the truck wouldn't be too obvious if someone happened by. I doubted anyone would. I grabbed my gear and walked up, boots soft in the wet fall grass. When I opened the front door, what was left of it, it creaked like a scream and swung into blackness. I stood there for a while just taking it in. The place smelled like mold, dust, and would rot. I swept a beam from the flashlight across the inside. The room was small, just one main area and a back hallway. I could see an old cast iron stove off to one side, a broken table in the middle, and what looked like a stack of firewood long since turned to fungus. I saw signs of animals, raccoon droppings in one corner, maybe rat nests in another, but nothing that looked recent. I swept out the floor with a branch I found outside, laid down my tarp and sleeping bag, then heated up a can of chili. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and ate while watching the woods turn dark through a cracked window. It was cold but not unbearable. The propane heater helped. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. The next morning, I walked a few miles around the woods, just exploring. There were no trails, no signs of other people. Just the wind, the birds, and now and then the rustle of something bigger. I saw deer prints and some broken branches that might have been a bear, but nothing to worry about. The cabin, once I returned, felt different. Not bad, just heavier. Maybe it was the way the light came in at that angle or the way the door wouldn't stay shut unless I braced a chair against it. But I reminded myself this was what I wanted. Quiet, solitude, peace. By the third day, things began to shift. I started noticing small things that I couldn't quite explain. The first was the boots. I always left mine just inside the door. On the third morning, I woke up and they were turned around, facing inward like someone had stepped out of them. I figured maybe I kicked them in my sleep or something, but that night I made sure. I lined them up, heels against the wall. When I woke up, they were near the door again, facing me. I tried not to let it bother me. Maybe I moved them and forgot. Maybe a raccoon got inside. I checked for signs but found nothing. No fresh droppings, no chewed food wrappers, no scratch marks. The next thing was the back room. I hadn't touched it. The door was swollen shut from the humidity and didn't move when I tried it the first day. I figured it was just storage or maybe collapsed inside. But on the fourth night, I heard something from behind that door, just once, like something shifting, something falling over. A thud. I sat up in the dark and just stared at that door for a long time. Nothing else came.
No sounds.
No movement. The next morning, the door was cracked open, just an inch, but it had definitely been shut. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The wood around the frame looked the same, no fresh scrapes or damage. The hinges didn't look disturbed. I pulled the door open wider. Stuck, but it moved. Inside was a small room, maybe 8 by 8, with a pile of old blankets in one corner and a rusted cot on the far wall. The blankets were dirty and smelled like mildew, but they looked newer than the rest of the cabin. The cot was bent, one leg broken, and the mattress was torn open at one end. I didn't go in. I just closed the door again and wedged a piece of firewood against it. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on, watching shadows move across the walls, every creak of the cabin sounding like a step. I told myself it was my own nerves, that I wasn't used to real silence. But deep down, I didn't believe that. On the sixth day, I found tracks outside. Not boot prints, bare feet. Human. They were small, maybe size 8 or 9, but wide. Flat-footed. I followed them for a while, down the slope behind the cabin, through leaves and across some muddy patches where they were clearer. The strange part was that they moved in a circle. They didn't lead to the road or deeper into the woods. They just looped around the cabin and disappeared. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with the rifle across my lap, lantern dimmed, eyes on the door. I didn't hear anything at first, just the wind and the soft creaks of the walls settling. But around 2 in the morning, I swear I heard breathing. Not mine, not close, but there, from behind the back door again. Deep, slow, wet breaths. I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, until it stopped. I didn't check. I waited until daylight. When I opened the back room again, nothing had changed, but the blankets were gone. I was done after that. I packed up everything in about 10 minutes, barely ate, just shoved it all into the truck and started driving. The tires slipped in the mud, and I nearly got stuck twice, but I didn't stop. The last thing I saw as I pulled away was a figure. Not close, maybe 100 yards up on the ridge behind the cabin. Just a shape between 2 trees.
Bare skin.
Pale, watching, not moving. I didn't wait to see more. I made it back to Springfield by nightfall and never told anyone what happened. I didn't want to deal with the questions, the doubt. A few weeks later, I looked up old land records to see who the property belonged to. Turned out it had never been officially transferred after the original owner left. Just a name, Walter Crane. No known family. No death certificate. Just gone. I never found any reports about people squatting in the area. No missing persons, no local crimes. Just empty forest. Silence. Like nothing happened. But I know what I saw. I haven't gone camping since. I sold the truck, moved into the city, and took a desk job. I don't hike. I don't travel. Sometimes I still hear breathing at night. I know it's in my head, but it feels too real. That old cabin is probably still out there. And whatever was watching me is probably still there, too. I was 31 that year, living in a rented apartment in Tulsa, Oklahoma, working remote tech support for a construction software company. I'd just come out of a messy breakup with someone I'd been seeing for 4 years, and I needed space. Not just emotional space, but real, physical space. I needed trees, silence, and clean air. I didn't care where I got it from. So in mid-September of 2021, I rented a remote cabin up in the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas, close to a small town called Mount Ida. It was a single-room wood cabin with no Wi-Fi, no plumbing, just an outhouse out back, and no cell service. The only way in or out was by a dirt road that twisted uphill from the main highway about 5 miles down. It was advertised as a hunter's retreat on an old listing site I stumbled across. The place wasn't even on Google Maps. You had to follow handwritten directions sent over email after booking. It was cheap, too, probably because of how hard it was to find. I brought a few coolers of food, a 5-gallon water jug, an old .38 revolver I inherited from my uncle, and enough books to last the week. I also brought a small battery pack that could charge my Kindle and headlamp. No one knew exactly where I was except my older brother, Calvin. I didn't want to be bothered. I got there on a Sunday morning. The weather was warm but dry, and the dirt road kicked up dust as my truck climbed it. The cabin was tucked into a clearing surrounded by pine and oak. It looked like something out of the early 80s, with a metal roof streaked with rust, and faded wood that looked like it hadn't been treated in decades. But it had a working lock, no holes in the roof, and the outhouse out back didn't smell like death. That was good enough for me. The first couple of days were quiet. I'd wake up early, cook breakfast on a propane stove, sit out on the porch with coffee, and just listen. The woods made all kinds of soft, constant sounds: birds, insects, wind in the trees, the kind of white noise you forget you need. I took long walks with a compass and paper map in my back pocket, marked trees with chalk, and always made sure to return before sunset. I'd sleep with the door locked and the gun beside the cot, just in case. By the third night, I noticed things felt off. Not loud, not obvious, just strange. It started with the sounds. The first 2 nights, the woods made that soft hum of animal life: crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. But on the third night, everything seemed to stop around 1 a.m. I remember waking up to pee and realizing how dead the air sounded. It was just silence. No wind, no bugs, just the creak of the old wooden frame when I stepped off the cot. I walked out barefoot, lit by my headlamp, and did my business near the edge of the trees. That's when I got the feeling. Not fear, at least not yet, but awareness. Like something was there. Like I wasn't alone. I scanned the woods, light bouncing between trunks and branches. I didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't go away. I stayed still a while, listening. Then I shook it off, walked back inside, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I didn't do much walking. I stuck close to the cabin, chopped some firewood even though I didn't need it, and just tried to keep busy. I kept looking up at the tree line. That feeling didn't fade. Something had shifted, and I couldn't explain why. I even unpacked the gun and set it on the table by the cot with a few loose rounds next to it. That night, things got worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Not just absence of noise this time, but something real. It was a short, sharp sound, like a stick snapping. I sat up instantly, still dressed from earlier. I grabbed the gun and stood at the window. It was too dark to see anything, but I waited. A minute passed. Then another sound, softer this time. Leaves crunching. Then nothing again. I stood there for what felt like half an hour, just watching the dark. Then, right when I was starting to think maybe it was a deer or maybe nothing at all, I saw something. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. I saw a faint, flickering light. A flashlight, maybe? No, it was dimmer, unsteady, like the light from a lantern. It moved between the trees about 40 yards out, barely visible through the woods. Too far for details, but I could tell it was being carried by someone or something, moving slow, careful. I froze. There weren't any neighbors within a few miles. I hadn't seen another soul since I got there. This wasn't a place people just wandered into. If someone was out there, they either knew I was here or they were very lost. I watched the light weave between the trees, moving horizontally across the slope behind the cabin, then slowly fade. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was wired on adrenaline and too stubborn to pack up. I told myself it could have been a hunter. Could have been someone camping illegally on federal land nearby. Could have been someone collecting firewood with an old kerosene lamp. But I didn't believe it. I walked the area where I thought the light had passed. Nothing. No boot prints, no trash, no smell of kerosene or gas. Just pine needles and dry leaves. That afternoon, I heard something again while gathering water from a creek about 100 yards east. This time it was clearer, 3 short steps, then silence. I called out. No answer. I stood there, breathing slow, eyes moving across the trees. Then another sound, something being set down. Not dropped, just placed. Something heavy. I backed up toward the cabin, water jug forgotten, and didn't go back out the rest of the day. That night, the real fear came. It started with light again. Around 1:40 a.m., a faint orange glow began moving slowly through the trees to the south. Then another glow appeared, about 10 feet away from the first. 2 lights, maybe 2 people. They weren't flashlights. The color was too warm. Firelight, maybe, but small, contained. They moved in a way that felt wrong, like they were trying not to make sound, like they were trained. I killed the lantern inside and watched from the window again. The lights came closer than the night before, maybe 20 yards out now, near the edge of the clearing. I held my breath. Then one of them stopped, just stopped moving. I couldn't see what was holding it. I couldn't see a body or a silhouette, but the light didn't sway anymore. It was like someone had crouched down, maybe sat. I stayed at the window until my legs started to cramp. The lights stayed there for hours. Around 4:30 a.m., they started to move again, then slowly disappeared. I left the cabin for the first time at full daylight, packed everything up in record time. When I walked behind the cabin to check the outhouse, I stopped. On the ground, about 10 feet from the back door, were fresh shoe prints in the dirt. Not boots, not mine, not animal. Shoes, regular athletic shoes. Size looked like a man's. One of the prints was half over a patch of moss that hadn't been disturbed the day before. Someone had walked right up behind the cabin in the night. That broke me. I drove out fast, tires skidding on the dirt road. I didn't even care if I left things behind. I just had to get out. Back in Mount Ida, I used the payphone outside a gas station to call my brother, told him where I'd been, what happened, and to never book that cabin for anyone. He didn't say much, just asked if I was okay and told me to head home. I never reported it, never even told the owners. What would I say? Someone was in the woods watching me with lanterns? Someone walked around my cabin at night? No one would do anything with that. Back in Tulsa, I couldn't sleep for days. I kept imagining those lights out my bedroom window. I kept hearing the crunch of leaves. I kept thinking about those prints. There were two things that bothered me the most. One, whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They weren't lost. They were watching, waiting, and they got closer every night. Two, on my last morning there, when I unlocked the truck and tossed my bags into the back seat, I noticed something on the driver's side mirror. It was a smudge, like a fingerprint. One long, greasy fingerprint. Whoever it was had touched my truck. They were right there. I haven't been back to the mountains since, and I never will. I didn't think much of going alone at first. I'd done plenty of solo trips in the past, but this time I brought Buck with me. Buck's my 3-year-old black lab, loyal, strong, never leaves my side. It was the summer of 2021, late July, and I needed a break from work. I'd been grinding at a machine shop in Central Oregon for the past 8 months, and the heat, the clanking, and the routine were wearing me down. I'd found the cabin listing online. A guy I used to know from high school had posted about his uncle's place up in the Wallowa Mountains, near a forgotten patch of forest where not many people hiked anymore. Remote, no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, no power. It sounded perfect. There was a narrow road that led off the main highway, about a mile of dirt and gravel, and then a small open clearing where the old wooden cabin sat, just a few feet off a slope that overlooked a dry creek bed. I packed up the essentials. Some dry food, canned stuff, propane stove, lantern, sleeping bag, 2 coolers of water, some tools and Buck's gear, his food, bowl, leash, and a thick blanket he always used at night. The plan was to stay 5 days. Enough time to rest, clear my head, hike a little, maybe shoot my old compound bow at some targets I'd set up. The drive took a full day. I arrived late afternoon, sun still high but cooling down. The forest air was rich with pine and dirt, that smell that only real woods have. The cabin looked just like the photos. Single floor, front porch with cracked wood, faded green roof, small wood shed nearby. The windows had old-fashioned crossbars and no curtains. Inside, it was dusty but sturdy. One room with a twin bed against the wall, a small table, a cast-iron stove, and a cabinet with some leftover supplies from whoever was here last, probably months ago. I unpacked slowly, kept the back of my truck open so Buck could jump in and out while sniffing around. He was alert, tail wagging slightly, moving back and forth between the trees and the porch. I noticed he didn't go too far. Maybe he felt the silence too. First night went by easy. I cooked some beans and sausage on the portable stove, drank a couple beers, and listened to the wind move through the trees. Buck slept near the door. No sounds, no problems. Second day, I hiked a bit westward from the cabin. There was an overgrown trail leading through thick forest, brush up to my waist in parts, and several broken branches that looked like something heavy had come through recently. Could have been elk or bear, maybe even a moose, though I hadn't heard of them coming this far down. I didn't bring a gun, just a knife and some bear spray. Not because I was brave, just stupid, maybe. The cabin had a long-handled axe leaning by the porch. I figured I'd bring it inside before dark. Something about the place gave me an edge, like I was waiting for something to go wrong. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, Buck was acting strange. He usually greeted me full force, jumping up, tail wagging like crazy. This time, he just stared at me from the porch and made a low noise in his throat. Not a growl, more like an anxious rumble. I looked around. Nothing seemed off. I walked around the cabin, checked the small shed, still locked. Inside, I swept through with a flashlight just to ease my nerves. No sign of animals, people, or anything. That night, I barely slept. Buck wouldn't settle. Every time I dozed off, he'd get up, walk to the door, scratch once or twice, then sit staring into the dark. I got up around 2 a.m. to pee and noticed he was staring hard at the tree line. His body stiff, ears up. I held the lantern high, but I couldn't see anything.
No sounds.
Just the heavy dark and the cool whisper of wind through the needles. Third day, I decided to stick close. Something felt wrong. I kept Buck on a leash, which I almost never do. He kept pulling to the side, like he smelled something deep in the woods, but I didn't let him go. I chopped some wood, cleaned up the area around the porch, and tried to stay busy. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The quiet here was different. Not peaceful, just heavy. Around sunset, Buck started growling. This time it was real. Deep, sharp, focused. He stood at the window with his back hair raised. I rushed over, axe in hand, and looked out, but again, nothing. Just woods and fading light. But Buck wouldn't calm down. Not even after I gave him food. He just circled the cabin for hours. That night, I blocked the door with a heavy chair and left the lantern burning. I tried to sleep with the axe beside me. Buck pressed against my legs. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight. Then I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just one single solid tap, like knuckles against the wall, not the door. I sat straight up. Buck was already up, growling low, his body rigid. I held the axe tight and waited. Nothing. No more knocks.
No footsteps. No breathing.
Just cold silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night. When the sun finally came, I stepped out with the axe and scanned the area. I did a slow circle around the cabin. Then I saw it. Footprint. It was in the soft dirt behind the shed. Not a boot print. Not barefoot either. Looked like someone in old, flat-soled shoes had been standing there. The print was deep, fresh. Just one. No others leading away or toward it. I looked up, back at the cabin, and felt my chest go tight. Someone had been watching. I didn't know what to do. It was day 4. One more night and I'd be gone. I didn't want to run like a coward, but something about that print, it wasn't just creepy, it was wrong. A person had stood right there, alone, in the dark, behind my cabin, doing nothing. I brought all my gear inside, even the coolers, and locked the door. I tied Buck's leash around my wrist so if he moved, I'd wake up. That final night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with the lantern off, axe on my lap. I stared at the window and the door, listening to every sound. Buck stayed close, silent. Around 1:40 a.m., he started shaking. Not whimpering, just full body trembles. I looked down at him, whispered a few calm words, and heard it again. Footsteps, slow, crunching through leaves, circling, first to the left of the cabin, then behind, then to the right, then nothing, then a knock, this time louder, not on the wall but the door. Buck lunged and barked hard, yanking my arm. I grabbed his collar, held him back, and stared at the door. I didn't move. Another knock, slower, heavier, then silence. We waited like that for what felt like an hour, but it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. The knocks didn't return. No more footsteps. The sky started to lighten. First hints of blue over the trees. I packed everything before the sun fully rose. I didn't even eat. I shoved it all in the truck, threw a blanket in the back for Buck, and peeled out down the gravel road, dust flying behind me. About a mile back down the road, I stopped when I hit a fallen tree I hadn't seen coming in. It wasn't huge, but it blocked most of the road. Looked fresh too, sap still dripping.
No chain sap marks.
Just split wood and splinters. Something had pushed it over. I got out and pulled it enough to drive past, heart racing the whole time. Buck was in the passenger seat, panting hard, still shaking. We made it back to the main road around noon. Cell signal returned about 15 minutes later, and I called a buddy just to hear another voice. I didn't explain everything. I just said I cut the trip short. Told him the area gave me the creeps. Back at home, Buck didn't eat much for 2 days. Slept close to my bed, even though he usually liked his own spot near the front door. Every time the wind rattled the window, he'd growl. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about it. But one afternoon, I checked the trail cam I'd strapped to a tree near the front of the cabin on the second day. I'd left it there by mistake. The last photo it captured was from the third night, about 3:12 a.m. A tall figure stood just outside the front porch light's range. No face, just a person, thin, still, arms at their side, head tilted. Just standing there. No one was supposed to be up there. The property was miles from any other cabin. No nearby roads. No signs anyone lived nearby. I never went back, and I never will. It was the fall of 2016, and I was 33 at the time, working as a construction supervisor in Northwest Oregon. I had taken a 2-week break to get away from everything. Work had been rough, and so had my personal life. A breakup a few months earlier had left me feeling off balance, and I hadn't really given myself time to deal with it. I needed a quiet place, far away from people, just somewhere to think and reset. I remembered this small cabin my uncle used to own way back in the early 90s. It was tucked away off a little used logging road about 15 miles outside a town called Millersburg. After my uncle passed away, the land was left unused. The cabin was still standing last I checked, and nobody ever went out there. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room wood structure with a tin roof, no electricity, and no running water. It was built decades ago, mostly by hand, sitting at the edge of a long stretch of second-growth forest, not far from the base of a ridge that hunters used to visit in the fall. So I packed up my old pickup with supplies, cans of soup, dry food, extra water, a camp stove, a good flashlight, a knife, a .38 I always carried when I went out alone like this, and my sleeping bag. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just said I'd be camping in the hills. I liked it better that way. The first day, I drove until the road turned to gravel, then kept going until even that became a narrow dirt path. It was rough in some places, overgrown in others, but I knew the way. The cabin sat behind a small clearing, mostly hidden unless you knew where to look. The roof had some rust, and the front step sagged, but otherwise it looked just like I remembered. No signs of anyone having been there in years. That was perfect. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked the trails I used to explore when I was younger, cooked over the stove, and read through a couple of old paperbacks I'd brought along. It rained a little the second night, just enough to patter on the roof and make me fall asleep early. I didn't see a single other person, not even signs of a hunter or camper. The solitude was exactly what I needed. On the third morning, I was splitting some firewood near the edge of the clearing when I noticed something odd. Small bits of trash, not far from the trees. Just a torn chip bag and an old beer can, but they hadn't been there when I arrived. I knew that for sure. I don't like litter, and I would have picked them up right away. It looked recent, too, no rust on the can, no fading on the bag. I assumed it might have been left by someone passing through, maybe a hunter or a hiker, even though I hadn't seen any vehicles on the trail coming in. Still, it wasn't worth worrying about. That night, I kept the fire going a bit longer than usual, and I sat out in the clearing with my back against the log pile. I listened to the wind moving through the trees and watched the sky go dark. Around 9 or so, just before I went inside, I thought I heard something. Branches breaking in the woods, not far off. It wasn't a deer. I know the sound of a deer moving through brush. This was slow. 2 steps, then a pause. Another step, then nothing. I stared toward the trees for a good 5 minutes, not moving, just listening. Eventually, I decided it had to be an animal and went inside. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. I stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight. The air was colder, and the clouds had moved in again. As I was heading back in, I noticed something near the treeline. Just for a second, in the beam of the flashlight, something pale, like a face maybe, but it was gone just as quick as I saw it. My heart jumped, and I stood there for a minute, scanning the trees, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. I went back in and locked the door, which I hadn't bothered to do the previous nights. The next day, I circled the area near the treeline. There were no footprints, no obvious signs of anyone being there. But I did notice the trash was gone. Not just moved, completely gone. That chip bag and can I'd seen the day before weren't there anymore. I searched around, even checked some of the animal paths nearby, but didn't find anything. That left a weird feeling in my chest, like maybe someone had been here, had seen me, and didn't want to leave a trace. I thought about leaving, but told myself I was being paranoid. I had a gun, I had supplies, and whoever it was, they'd probably already moved on. That night, it rained again, harder this time. I stayed inside the whole time, listening to it drum against the roof. At some point, maybe around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something above the rain. Footsteps on the porch. 1 or 2, then nothing. I held my breath and turned off the lantern. I stayed still for maybe an hour, just listening. Nothing followed. No knock. No sound of someone trying the door. Just the wind and rain. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I opened the door slowly. The porch looked the same, but I noticed something in the dirt just off to the side, boot prints. Not mine. I wear size 11s. These were bigger, maybe a 13 or 14, and the tread pattern wasn't like mine either. Deeper grooves, wider spacing. Whoever it was had been out there in the rain, just standing on my porch. That was the moment I knew it wasn't just paranoia. Someone was nearby, watching, maybe waiting for something. I packed up most of my gear right then and there, left out just enough for one more night, planning to leave first thing in the morning. That last night was the worst. I didn't light a fire, didn't turn on the lantern, just sat in the dark with the gun in my hand, listening. Every little noise made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time it wasn't just footsteps. There was a dragging sound, something being pulled through the dirt, passed by the side of the cabin, then paused. I held my breath. My finger rested on the trigger. I didn't move. For the next half hour, I heard nothing. And then, I don't know how else to describe it, something brushed against the back wall. Not a knock, not a bang, just a long, slow scrape, like a piece of wood being dragged across the outside of the cabin. It was low, near the floor. I raised the gun and aimed at the wall even though I couldn't see anything. Eventually, the noise stopped. I waited until the sky started to lighten before I moved. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything else inside, and left. I didn't even eat. I didn't stop. I walked down the trail with the gun in my hand until I reached the truck. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was the driver's side door. It had scratches on it, deep ones, like someone had used a rock or a knife. They ran across the door in long horizontal lines, almost like someone had been trying to write something but gave up. I got in, started the engine, and left without looking back. I drove straight home that morning, didn't stop once except for gas. I didn't sleep until the next night. Even then, I kept the lights on in my apartment. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it, about those footsteps, that pale face, the scratches. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but they weren't some harmless drifter. A few months later, I tried to find information about the area online. There wasn't much. No reports, no missing persons, no arrests. But I did stumble across an old message board thread from 2012. Someone had written about staying in a hunting cabin not far from Millersburg. They mentioned hearing footsteps at night, seeing someone in the trees. They didn't go into detail, just said they'd left early and never went back. That was enough for me. I haven't returned to that cabin since. I told my cousin about it once, and he said I probably imagined it. But I didn't. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And most of all, I know how I felt. Like I was being hunted. Like someone was waiting for the right moment. The worst part is not knowing what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I sold the truck the next year. Every time I looked at the scratches on that door, I remembered the sound of something scraping against the wood, the feeling of being watched, the size of those footprints. I don't go out alone anymore, and I don't tell people where I'm going when I hike. Not because I want to be alone, but because I know now there are places out there where someone might be watching. And if you don't leave fast enough, they might decide you're not going to. I was 32 years old when I took a seasonal job as a park ranger up in northern Idaho, near the edge of the Clearwater National Forest. It was late September 2016, and I'd just come off a rough breakup. I was burned out from my job in Boise and needed to get away from the city, people, and everything that reminded me of my old life. The ranger position offered a cabin, solitude, and quiet hours. That's what I wanted. No people, just trees, rivers, wildlife, and the rhythm of days shaped by weather and sunlight. The cabin was more like a large shack than a proper home. It was built back in the 70s for trail rangers and fire watchers. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a wood stove, and a kitchen with a rusty propane range. It sat at the end of a long, rutted dirt road, 25 miles from the nearest paved road. I was told by the main ranger office in Pierce that once the snow hit hard, I'd be stuck up there unless I wanted to snowshoe out or use the snowmobile, which broke down every other week. The guy who showed me around, a guy named Don who looked like he'd been carved out of the forest itself, told me with a shrug, "Some seasons are easy, some seasons ain't." The first couple weeks were peaceful. I spent my days checking trails, marking down animal signs, keeping the bear bins locked, and logging damage from late summer storms. It rained often, sometimes just misty drizzles, sometimes hard downpours that shook the trees. The forest floor stayed damp, and mushrooms popped up everywhere. I loved the silence. No traffic, no city noise, just wind, bird calls, and the sound of my boots squelching in mud. One of my duties was checking a remote campsite area called Twin Pines. It was a good 5-mile hike from the cabin, over a ridge and down near a creek. Not a lot of people camped there, especially this late in the year, but I had to check for trash or signs of squatters. On October 5th, I went out to Twin Pines like usual. The sky was low and gray, and a light drizzle was falling. When I got to the site, I noticed a small fire pit that looked fresh, still a little warm. Around it were old beer cans, torn food wrappers, and a damp blanket rolled up and shoved under a log. The blanket stank, mildew, body odor, and something sharp underneath it, metallic, almost. It was clear someone had been there recently. I took pictures, bagged up the trash, and made a note to report it back. I looked around for signs of a trail leading away from the site. Sure enough, there were tracks, boots, deep from the wet ground, leading up toward a deer trail on the east side of the camp. I didn't follow them far, just enough to see they cut across the ridge toward an old, disused fire trail that hadn't been maintained in years. That night, back in the cabin, the wind picked up hard. Rain pounded the roof and battered the windows. Around 11 p.m., I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard something clatter outside. I figured it was a branch or the trash bin lid. I got up, pulled on my boots, and grabbed the flashlight. The rain had eased up, but the wind was still strong. I stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the light across the yard. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I spotted the bin, knocked over, lit about 10 feet away. I walked over to pick it up and nearly slipped in the mud. The bin was empty. No raccoon did that. Then I saw the footprints. 2 sets. One heading to the cabin, one heading away. I froze for a second. The light trembled in my hand. The prints were boot prints, not animal, not bare feet. Heavy treads like hiking boots. They led straight up to the porch steps and then turned back. I followed them to the tree line, where they disappeared into soaked pine needles and leaf litter. Back inside, I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and sat by the wood stove with my hunting rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep much. Over the next few days, little things happened. A piece of firewood went missing from the pile. I'd hear branches snapping deep in the woods at night. I found a dirty sock in the creek behind the cabin. I told myself it was probably just a hunter camping illegally. I left a note at the Twin Pines site saying the area was closed for the season, but it was gone 2 days later. On October 14th, I went to check the fire trail I'd seen the boot prints leading toward. The trail was overgrown and slick. About a mile up, I came across a makeshift shelter built into the side of a hill. Someone had used old tarps, fallen branches, and even parts of a torn tent to build it. Inside were a sleeping bag, a small fire ring, and a bunch of random junk, an old radio, some empty cans of beans, a cracked thermos. There were knife marks in the bark of a tree nearby, deep and deliberate. I didn't linger. I hiked back to the cabin and radioed Don at the main office. He told me they knew people sometimes squatted in the woods during the fall. He said to document everything and keep an eye out, but not to confront anyone unless it was an emergency. People got their own reasons for hiding out, he said. After that, I kept my rifle loaded and near me at all times. I started setting up tripwires with small bells around the cabin. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside felt like a threat. Every snap of a twig or thump of a branch in the wind made my pulse jump. On the night of October 21st, everything came to a head. It was around 1 a.m. Rain was coming down in sheets. I was sitting in the kitchen, writing up my daily report by lantern light, when the bells outside rang. Just once. I grabbed the rifle and turned off the lantern. I moved to the window, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited. A minute passed. 2. Then I saw movement, just a flash of it. A figure. I couldn't make out details, just that someone was out there, moving slowly, deliberately, like they were circling the cabin. I didn't switch on any lights. I moved room to room in the dark, peeking out windows. The rain made it hard to see. But then, on the far side, near the back of the woodshed, I saw them again. Closer this time. Tall, wearing dark clothes, standing still, looking at the cabin. I raised the rifle. My hands were slick with sweat. I didn't aim to shoot unless they came closer. I just waited. Eventually, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. The next morning, I found more prints. Same boots. They circled the entire cabin, lingered near the windows, near the shed, and then led back into the forest. This time, I followed them. I tracked them for hours, deeper into the woods, farther than I'd gone before. Eventually, they led me to a small clearing I hadn't seen on any of the maps. In the middle of it was a shallow fire pit and what looked like pieces of fabric nailed to a tree. On closer inspection, they were parts of jackets, shirts, even a backpack, cut up and nailed flat like some kind of warning. There were bones in the pit, burned, not animal, not large, but the shape of one of them. I couldn't stop thinking it looked like a finger. I turned and got out of there fast. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the rifle, watching the windows. Every creak made me jump. The wind howled. I thought I heard footsteps outside, but it was impossible to tell with the rain and wind. The next morning, I packed everything, radioed Don and told him I was coming down early. He didn't ask questions, just said okay. I hiked out that afternoon, made it to the trailhead by dark, and drove straight back to Boise. Never looked back. A few weeks later, Don called. Said when they sent someone up to shut down the cabin for winter, they found my tripwires gone, the door open, and the place ransacked. No sign of animals, just muddy boot prints all over the floor, and a single clean hunting knife stuck into the table. I never went back. I still think about those nights, that shadow outside the window, the bells ringing in the rain, the bones in that fire pit. People think the forest is peaceful. They forget what can hide inside it. It had been 2 years since Emily died. We had been divorced for 4, but we were still close, in our own weird way. Some people stay bitter after a marriage ends, but that wasn't us. Even when we split, we kept things friendly. I still helped her with yard work sometimes. She still remembered my birthday. We just didn't work as husband and wife, but we never stopped being human toward each other. When she passed from cancer in 2023, I wasn't ready for how much it would hit me. By 2025, I was trying to keep my head above water. I was 48, still working long hours in construction around the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area. I didn't have much left in me by the end of each day. That spring, I finally took a week off. I told my boss I needed to get away for a while. No phone, no people. I just needed to be somewhere different. That's when I remembered the old cabin. Emily and I bought it together back in 2006, when things were still good. It sat on a wooded lot about 3 hours northwest, up near the Allegheny National Forest. We used to go there in the fall mostly, when the air got sharp and the leaves turned. It had no running water, no electricity, just a wood stove and a cot, but it felt like home. When we divorced, I gave it to her. She insisted on keeping it. She said it reminded her of a version of us she didn't want to forget. I hadn't been back there in over a decade. After her death, the cabin went to her cousin, but he lived out west and didn't want it. I found out through a lawyer that it had just been sitting there, untouched. He gave me permission to go up and use it if I wanted. He didn't care. He hadn't even been there once. I packed light. Some canned food, a camping stove, a rifle, a cooler of beer, some clothes, a sleeping bag. I loaded it all in my old Chevy and hit the road early on a Tuesday morning. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt. Just trees and sky and space. No traffic, no job, no hospital smell.
No graveyard.
The road up to the cabin was even rougher than I remembered. Dirt and rock, barely wide enough for one truck. I had to slow to a crawl in a few spots to avoid bottoming out. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, the sun was already dropping low behind the trees. The place looked smaller than it had in my memories. More crooked too, like time had been pushing down on it, but it was still standing. The front door creaked the same way I remembered. The inside smelled of dust, pine, and old fabric. Everything was still there. The little table we bought at a flea market, the dented metal lantern, the woven rug from some vacation I forgot. It felt like stepping into a paused memory. The first night was quiet. I cooked some beans over the little stove, drank a beer, and watched the light fade through the window. I read a few pages of an old paperback I found under the cot. Eventually, I crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off to the sound of the wind brushing the trees outside. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. The next day, I explored the area a bit. Walked down to the creek, sat on a rock for a long while. I didn't think much. I just let my mind empty out. I kept catching little flashes of Emily. Her face when she lit the fire for the first time, her laugh echoing across the water. But it didn't hurt. Not yet. That evening, I started to notice things. Not anything big, just Off. I was coming back from the creek when I saw a boot print in the mud near the edge of the trail. It was fresh. It wasn't mine. I checked. My boots were wider, and the tread was different. This one was narrower, deeper at the heel. I looked around, but the woods were still. Maybe a hunter passed through, I figured. Still, I felt something crawl across my shoulders. I told myself it was nothing and made dinner. Corned beef hash out of a can. I stayed up a little later that night, reading by the lantern, trying to shake the weirdness. The woods creaked and groaned, but that was normal. It was an old cabin, old trees, old wind. But sometime past midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound.
No smell.
Just stillness. I lay there in the dark, heart thumping, eyes open wide. Then I realized what it was. The front door was cracked open. I knew I had latched it. I always did. It didn't close tight unless you gave it a hard shove and turned the latch. I'd done it out of habit, like I always had. But now it hung open a few inches. The night air slipped in, cold and wet. I got up slowly. I didn't have my glasses on yet, so everything was a blur. I felt around for the flashlight, clicked it on, and stepped toward the door. I shone the light out into the trees. Nothing, just black trunks and leaves shifting in the breeze. I shut the door, hard, and latched it again. Then I dragged the little table in front of it for good measure. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around the clearing. No signs of anything, no tracks, no marks on the door. I started thinking maybe I didn't latch it after all. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. Still, I carried the rifle with me that day. By the fourth day, the woods started to feel tighter, like the trees had moved in a little closer. I couldn't explain it. I'd grown up around woods. I hunted, camped, fished, but something about this felt different, like the forest was watching. I caught myself turning around every few minutes during my hikes. I think I heard a branch snap or something shifting in the brush, but it always stopped as soon as I looked. That night, it happened again. This time, I knew I latched the door. I double-checked, triple-checked, but at 3:12 a.m., I remember the time because I checked my watch. I woke up to that same cold air on my face. The door was wide open, not cracked, wide, and the table I had dragged in front of it, it was back where it had originally been, pushed neatly against the wall. I didn't move at first. I just stared. My rifle was right next to me. I picked it up slowly, thumbed the safety off. Then I stepped toward the doorway, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. I swept the beam across the clearing, and that's when I saw him, about 20 feet from the cabin, standing just at the edge of the trees. A man, just standing there, tall, maybe 6 feet 3 inches or so, wearing a dark jacket, pants that looked too clean for the woods. I couldn't see his face. He didn't move when the light hit him. I raised the rifle halfway. "Don't move," I said out loud. Before I remembered, I was supposed to stay quiet, but he didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't run. Just stood there, half in shadow. Then I blinked. Just a long blink. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. I stayed up until daylight, sitting on the floor with my back against the far wall, rifle ready. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I walked the perimeter, found nothing.
No prints.
No trail. The ground was soft. I should have seen something, but there was nothing. I stayed one more night because I told myself I wouldn't run, but I barely slept. Every sound felt sharp. Every gust of wind felt like breath. The next morning, I packed everything, loaded up the truck and locked the cabin. I didn't look back when I drove off. It's been a few months since then. I still don't have an explanation. I've tried. Maybe it was someone squatting out there. Maybe some drifter knew about the cabin. Maybe I imagined parts of it. Maybe grief does things to the brain. But that man, I know what I saw. He was real, and he didn't belong out there. I haven't told anyone about it. Who would believe me? There was no crime, no harm, no proof. Just a door swinging open in the night. Just a man who didn't speak. Just the kind of fear that wraps around your spine and doesn't let go. I haven't been back to the cabin. I don't think I will. Whatever was left of Emily in that place, I think it stayed. And maybe that part of me did too. Some places are better left to the trees. I hadn't been back to my grandfather's cabin since I was a kid. It sat at the edge of a thick patch of forest, almost 20 miles from the nearest town, deep in the northern edge of Wisconsin. I never used to think much of it when I was younger. It was just that place we went in the summer, quiet, plain, and a little dull. But after my grandfather passed away in 2013, it stayed locked up. My father never went back, and I never had a reason to, not until last fall. I was 34 at the time, burnt out from work and needing a break. I worked long hours in Chicago in a logistics firm, living in a condo surrounded by traffic and sirens. That kind of life slowly makes you feel like your brain's stuck in a blender, just spinning and rattling nonstop. I was tired of the noise, the lights, the constant pressure. I needed somewhere to clear my head, and the only place that came to mind was the old cabin. It was still in the family, technically under my father's name, but he had no plans to use it. He told me over the phone, "You want to go up there? Fine by me. Just be careful. Place hasn't been touched in years." I loaded up my dog, a black lab named Moose, into the back of my 4Runner and made the drive north. It took a little over 6 hours with traffic and fuel stops, but by the time I reached the long gravel road that led toward the forest, my phone had already lost signal, and the air smelled like pine and cold dirt. The road was mostly still intact, though the last half-mile was littered with tree debris and potholes. As I drove up the winding slope, I saw the cabin come into view through a clearing in the trees. It looked the same as I remembered, dark wood siding, a steep roof, and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. I parked just off to the right of the cabin and stepped out. Moose jumped out behind me, sniffing around with his tail up. The place was silent, the kind of silence you don't notice until you've been surrounded by city sounds for too long. I walked up the porch and unlocked the front door with the old brass key my dad had mailed me. Took some effort. The lock was stiff and the door dragged against the floor, but eventually it gave way and I stepped inside. The air smelled stale, dusty, and woody. The floor creaked like I remembered. Everything was still there. The plaid couch, the stone fireplace, the tiny kitchen off to the side, even a stack of old Field and Stream magazines on the coffee table. I opened a few windows to let fresh air in, swept up the dead bugs and leaves, and brought in my gear. It was cold, but manageable. There was no electricity, so I had brought a cooler, battery lanterns, a camp stove, and a sleeping bag. The plan was to stay for a week. No phone, no people, just me and the dog. I spent the first evening cleaning and organizing. Moose curled up in front of the fireplace, which I got going using old chopped wood stacked outside under the overhang. The warmth helped a lot. That night, I fell asleep early, the silence outside pressing up against the walls like a blanket. I didn't even need earplugs. The next morning, I took Moose on a hike. There was a trail that looped around the back of the property and led toward a stream about a mile out. We walked for a couple of hours and everything felt normal. The trees were bare, it was late October, and the wind had a sharp edge to it. I didn't see another soul, not even footprints. The only signs of life were deer tracks and squirrel chatter. It was perfect. That peace held through the second day. I spent it cutting firewood, reading, and jotting things down in a small notebook I'd brought along. Moose was alert but calm. He'd sit out on the porch with his ears perked and his eyes scanning the trees, but he didn't act nervous or scared. I figured he was just watching for rabbits or birds. That changed on the third night. It was sometime past midnight. I had just drifted off when I felt Moose climb onto the end of the sleeping bag. He was heavy, and I could feel him shift, restless. Then he growled, a low, quiet rumble in his chest that I hadn't heard before, not from him. I opened my eyes and sat up slowly, blinking in the darkness. The lantern was still on, dim but glowing. Moose was staring at the front door, stiff as a board. At first, I thought maybe it was a raccoon or some animal nosing around, but Moose didn't growl at animals. He chased them, barked maybe. This was different. I got up, grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on. I walked to the window next to the door and looked out. Nothing. The woods were still. No wind, no movement, just empty trees and shadows. I stayed up for an hour after that. I checked the door, still locked. Looked around the porch. Nothing there. Eventually, I laid back down, but sleep didn't come easy. Moose stayed up too, still looking at the door. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a fox or a porcupine. Moose might have smelled something odd. But deep down, I had that tight feeling in my stomach, like something wasn't adding up. I took him for another long walk, hoping to shake the tension. While we were out, I spotted something strange. About 200 yards into the woods behind the cabin, I noticed a tree that had markings on it, deep cuts, like someone had dragged a blade across it. The marks were deliberate, not scratches from animals. I looked around and found another tree with the same marks, maybe 20 feet away. It wasn't much, but it didn't feel right. Nobody was supposed to be out here. The property was surrounded by 30 acres of thick woods, all private land. There shouldn't be anyone else here. That afternoon, I circled back and checked the area more thoroughly. I found more marks on trees, like someone was trying to leave a trail or mark a path. Some were fresher than others. I followed them for maybe half a mile before the cuts disappeared. No trash, no prints, nothing else. Just those quiet signs that someone had been out here with a knife, carving into trees. That night, I didn't sleep much. Moose paced the cabin like he was guarding it. I kept the lantern on again, this time with my camp knife beside me. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like a crunching step on dry leaves. I froze and listened. Another step, then silence. I waited, heart racing, not breathing. I didn't want to move. Moose stood, alert again, hackles raised. Another noise, closer to the side of the cabin. Then silence again. I didn't go outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I walked the perimeter of the cabin first thing. Nothing obvious. But about 10 feet from the back wall, I found a footprint, clear as day. A boot print, deep in the soft dirt. Too big to be mine. I wear size 10. This was at least a 12 or 13. Moose sniffed it and growled. I grabbed my gear and hiked out to my truck to check it. Still locked. No damage. But the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. Someone was out here. That afternoon, I followed the tree markings again. I went farther this time, deeper into the woods. About an hour in, I found something that made my skin go cold. A small clearing, just a rough patch in the trees, and in the middle of it, a hunting blind. Not a tree stand, but a small ground blind made from camo netting and sticks. It looked fresh. Inside it was a folding chair, a thermos, and some trash protein bar wrappers, a cigarette butt. Somebody had been sitting here watching. Watching what? I looked back the way I came. From this spot, you could just barely see through the trees toward my cabin if the leaves were down, which they were this time of year. A direct line of sight. My stomach turned. I left the blind untouched and walked back quickly, checking behind me the whole way. Moose stayed close, ears up, steps silent. He didn't chase squirrels this time. He was too focused, like he felt it too. Back at the cabin, I started packing. My plan was to leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive the road at night, especially if the truck broke down out here. But I didn't sleep that night at all. Every sound outside made me jump. Every creak in the wall sounded like a step. I kept the lantern burning until the batteries died. Sometime around 5 a.m., I heard the screen door creak. That door hadn't moved all week. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. Moose was standing already, staring at the door, growling again, louder this time. Then silence. I waited. Nothing. At first light, I opened the door and stepped outside. I didn't see anyone, but on the wooden step, there was a mark, a muddy boot print, the same size as the one behind the cabin. I packed everything fast. I didn't even eat. I loaded Moose and my gear, locked the cabin, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station an hour away, where my phone picked up signal again. I never reported it. What would I even say? Someone was watching me. Someone who knew I was alone. Someone who had been close enough to the cabin to leave prints, but quiet enough not to be seen. I haven't been back since. I don't think I ever will. The cabin still sits out there, deep in the trees, gathering dust and leaves in silence. My father says we should sell it, but I told him to just let it rot. Let the woods take it back. Whatever was out there that week didn't need ghosts or legends to be scary. It was a person, flesh and blood, and that's what made it worse. Because real people don't follow rules. They don't vanish at dawn. They don't leave behind signs you can explain. They watch, they wait, and if I hadn't left when I did, I don't know what might have happened next. It was November 2021, and I was 33 at the time. I'd just gone through a breakup, and I needed space, silence, and something that felt real. Something away from screens and people and phone calls. So I decided to head out to a small hunting cabin I hadn't visited in years. It belonged to a friend of my father's who'd passed away, and nobody really used it anymore except me when I needed to get away. It was deep in the woods near Swan Valley, Idaho. Far enough that cell service dropped off about 10 minutes before you reached the end of the road. No power, no running water, just an old wood frame cabin with a metal roof and a concrete block chimney that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. I packed up my truck with a cooler of food, a couple boxes of .308 rounds, my rifle, a hatchet, some water containers, and the rest of the basic gear. I took some firewood, too, even though there was plenty lying around up there. The idea was to get away for 4 or 5 days, maybe hunt a little, maybe not. Mostly, I just wanted to sit in silence and let my head clear. The road to the cabin was always bad, but that year it was worse. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but everything was soggy and cold. Mud pulled at my tires and soaked the bottoms of my jeans every time I got out to check the trail. There were a few places where fallen branches blocked the road, and I had to get out, cut them away, drag them to the side, and keep going. The drive that should have taken 40 minutes from the main road took nearly 2 hours. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was down behind the mountains, and a gray-blue light had settled over the trees. It was cold enough that my breath came out in clouds, but not cold enough for snow just yet. I unlocked the cabin door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The smell hit me right away. Old dust, dry wood, and that faint bitter scent of mouse droppings. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it was what I expected. The cabin was small. One room with a raised cot on one side, an old iron stove in the middle, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves along the back wall with canned goods that had probably expired in the Bush administration. There was a hunting calendar still pinned up on one wall from 2014, yellowed and curled at the corners. A few cobwebs in the corners, mouse holes near the floorboards, and boot tracks in the dust that I figured were my own from last time. I got a fire going right away. The wood in the cabin was dry but light, so I mixed in some of the fresh oak I'd brought. I swept out the worst of the dust and dirt, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and boiled some water for instant noodles. I remember sitting there, eating that cup of noodles, listening to the fire crackle and feeling more peace than I'd felt in months. No cars, no city lights, no phones. Just the forest outside, tall and dark and silent. The first night passed easy. I didn't hear a thing outside except a few owls and the wind moving through the trees. I slept hard. In the morning, I made coffee on the wood stove and stepped out with my rifle, planning to hike toward the ridge where I'd seen elk sign years before. I wasn't desperate to shoot anything. I just wanted to walk, to breathe cold mountain air and maybe follow some fresh tracks. The woods were still damp from the last week's rain. Pine needles underfoot made everything soft and quiet. I hiked for hours, not seeing a single animal, but finding plenty of old sign, scat, hoof marks, claw marks in trees. I figured I'd go farther the next day. The whole time, I never saw another person. That part didn't surprise me. That area was too remote for most hunters. When I got back to the cabin that evening, something small caught my attention. I noticed a fresh scuff mark in the mud near the steps. It wasn't from my boots. I checked. The tread was wrong, like a flatter-soled shoe. I didn't think much of it right away. Could have been old, washed out by the rain, and just looked fresh. Still, it made me glance around more carefully. I checked the door. Still locked. Windows still shut. Nothing missing. I told myself it was nothing, but I kept my rifle closer that night. The next day, I headed in the opposite direction. Took a trail down toward a creek about a mile out. It had a little canyon area with steep walls and thick brush. I thought it might be a good place for deer to bed down. I didn't find any, but I did come across something weird. A piece of cloth hanging off a branch, like someone's flannel shirt had gotten torn and caught. It was gray-blue, wet and dirty, maybe the size of a dish towel. I thought maybe someone had camped nearby at some point and left it. Still, it looked pretty fresh. Not bleached, not brittle. I folded it and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. Figured I'd toss it in the fire later. That evening, back at the cabin, I was gut-tired from the hike. I cleaned my rifle, made some chili, and tried to read a book I'd brought, but I kept thinking about that cloth, about the scuff near the steps, about how I hadn't seen another hunter or even a trail marker in 2 days. It wasn't fear yet, just unease, something sitting in the back of my head like a splinter. I went to bed with my rifle leaning against the cot. Around midnight, I woke up needing to piss. The fire was mostly out, just coals glowing. I pulled on my boots and coat and stepped out into the dark. There was no moon that night, just stars. The woods were black. Cold air hit my face, and everything was dead quiet except for the faint creak of the cabin settling. I stepped a few feet off the porch, walked around to the side, and started to take a leak. That's when I heard it. Something out there, maybe 30 yards off. A stick breaking. I froze, tried to listen, then silence again. I zipped up, stepped back slowly, and kept my eyes on the trees. I didn't see movement, didn't hear anything else, but I swear I felt it. Something watching me. I backed into the cabin and bolted the door. Sat there in the dark for another hour, holding my rifle and staring at the window. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a fox, maybe a bear if I was unlucky. I still felt on edge, but I didn't want to ruin the trip over one noise in the woods. I made more coffee, hiked again. This time I stayed closer, never lost sight of the cabin. That afternoon I noticed something else. My boot prints from the day before had been partially stepped on. There were lighter marks overlapping mine. Someone had been walking in the same path, same area. I crouched down and stared at them for a while. Same flat-soled pattern I'd seen near the cabin steps. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone out there. When I got back, I checked everything. The cabin door, windows, my gear. Nothing was missing, but I found something strange in the fire pit. In the ash, under the blackened remains of last night's burn, there were charred scraps of something that didn't look like wood or paper. I used a stick to poke around. One was a piece of rubber. The other looked like burnt plastic, part of a zipper, maybe. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't burn anything except wood and food wrappers. Someone else had been using my fire pit. I kept my rifle close that night and didn't sleep much. I kept getting up, checking the windows, the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again, movement out in the trees. Not close, but loud enough to be a person stepping on underbrush. No pattern to it, just random crunches of leaves and twigs. It circled the cabin, then stopped. I didn't step outside this time. I stayed in, barely breathing. I didn't light the lamp, just sat in the dark, heart pounding, listening. Morning felt like it took forever. When it finally came, I made the decision to leave. I wasn't going to try and find the guy. I wasn't going to call the sheriff either. I just wanted to pack my things and get out. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was that someone had carved something into the side of a tree about 15 feet from the cabin. It wasn't words, just a shape like a triangle with a line through it. Sloppy but deep, fresh. Bark still curled at the edges. I didn't know what it meant. Maybe nothing, but it made my skin crawl. I packed everything fast, threw gear into the truck bed, doused the fire, made sure I had my rifle loaded and ready. Just before I left, I noticed something else. At the edge of the clearing, where the woods started, there was a small stack of stones, balanced one on top of the other, maybe 8 or 9 high. No reason for it to be there. It hadn't been there before. I didn't knock it down. I didn't go near it. I just got in the truck and drove. The trail out was rougher than I remembered. Deeper ruts, more down branches. A few times I had to get out and move things, and every time I stepped out of the truck, I felt eyes on me, like someone just out of view, standing perfectly still. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road and saw a gas station an hour later. Even now, years later, I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know if they lived in those woods or if they just moved through watching cabins like mine. I never saw them, never heard a voice. Just those quiet signs that someone else had been there, watching, waiting, maybe testing to see how I'd react. I never went back to that cabin. It's probably still standing out there, quiet and rotting in the cold. Maybe someone else found it. Maybe someone stayed the night and didn't notice the marks in the trees, or the stones by the edge of the clearing, or the faint prints in the mud. But I did, and I got out before I could find out what they really wanted. It was late September 2021 when I took a trip up to a cabin in northern Idaho. I just turned 33, and I needed to get away from the city, away from the noise, the traffic, the screen time. I'd been working from home ever since the pandemic started, and even though I was technically doing fine, I could feel something building up inside me. Stress, mostly, and restlessness. I'd been stuck in a cycle of waking up, sitting down in front of my computer, working until dinner, and going to bed without ever seeing something real. I wanted dirt under my nails, air that smelled like pine, and silence so thick it made my ears ring. I found the cabin through an old listing online. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything, just a guy named Carl advertising it on a wilderness forum. He said it used to belong to his uncle, and now he let people use it on their honor, as long as they cleaned up after themselves and didn't break anything. It was buried in the Panhandle, about 2 hours from the nearest town. A dirt road led most of the way up, and then you had to park and walk the last half mile. No power, no Wi-Fi, no plumbing, just a wood stove, an old pump for water, and a cot. I emailed Carl, wired him $200, and he sent me GPS coordinates and a long paragraph with instructions like how to prime the water pump, where the key was hidden, and how to latch the front door from the inside with a hook and eye lock. I drove up on a Thursday. The sky had been gray all week, and I could smell rain on the wind as I climbed the winding road. My Subaru had no trouble getting up the trail, though the road narrowed the higher I got. Trees leaned in on both sides, and the pine needles blanketing the ground made everything feel quiet, almost deadened. Eventually, the road ended at a small clearing where I parked. I loaded my backpack with food, clothes, a lantern, a battery pack for my phone, even though I figured I wouldn't get a signal, and a small hatchet. I slung it over my shoulder and started walking up the last bit of trail. Took maybe 15 minutes before I saw the cabin. It was tucked between 3 massive pines, with a little rocky hill rising up behind it. The structure looked like it had been there for decades. The logs were dark with age, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. But it was dry, solid, and private. Exactly what I was looking for. I found the key in the hollow stump Carl had mentioned and let myself in. The inside was small and smelled like old wood and mouse droppings, but nothing too bad. There was a cot in one corner, a wood stove in the middle of the room, a metal table against one wall, and shelves with some dusty supplies. Old matches, candles, and canned beans that had probably expired 10 years ago. The back window was fogged with grime, but I could see the tree line and part of the hill behind it. I spent that first day settling in. I unpacked, opened the shutters, and swept out the worst of the dust. I stacked firewood by the stove and tried out the pump, which worked but coughed like a dying dog. I made a small fire outside before dark and cooked some sausages over it, then watched the stars come out. I hadn't seen that many stars in years.
No clouds, no planes, no noise.
Just the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I felt like I'd finally unplugged from something that had been quietly draining me. That night, I lay in the cot with my sleeping bag zipped up tight. It got cold fast, but the little stove did the job. I stared at the ceiling beams and listened. Nothing. Total silence. Not even bugs. Took a long time to fall asleep, not because I was scared, just because it felt strange. My brain wasn't used to that kind of quiet. The second day was peaceful. I made coffee with a camp stove and sat out on the porch watching the sun creep over the trees. I spent a few hours hiking a nearby ridge and came back sweaty and winded, but happy. I washed off using water from the pump and rested in the shade. That evening, I wrote in a notebook and whittled a stick into a point, just for something to do with my hands. When it got dark, I lit a lantern and read an old paperback thriller I'd brought. I heard an owl at one point and smiled. Felt normal in a raw kind of way. Then came the third day. That was when things got weird. It started in the morning. I just stepped outside to relieve myself behind the bushes when I noticed something odd in the dirt by the side of the cabin. Footprint. Human. Boot tread. Looked pretty fresh. Not mine. I checked. My own were deep and angled from the walk-in, but this one was newer and came from behind the cabin, from the hill. I stood there a while, staring at it. It pointed toward the cabin like someone had walked right up to it. I scanned the trees behind the cabin but didn't see anything. No movement, no sound. I walked around the whole place just to be sure, but there was nothing else. No more prints, no trash, nothing missing. Still, it left a weird feeling in my stomach. I told myself it could have been old. Maybe someone else had stayed here recently. Maybe Carl hadn't cleared the place as thoroughly as he claimed. Still, I couldn't shake it. That night, I made sure to bolt the door and latch the windows shut. I sat inside with the lantern burning low and kept my hatchet nearby. I didn't hear anything, but I also didn't sleep much. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I thought I heard a branch snap outside, but it could have been a pine cone falling. Could have been an animal. I told myself that a lot. The fourth day, I decided to hike up behind the cabin to see where that print might have come from. I strapped on my boots, grabbed the hatchet just in case, and made my way up the hill. The slope was steep, covered in loose rocks and thick undergrowth, but there was a faint path leading through the trees, hardly a trail, more like a line where the brush had been pushed aside. I followed it. It went higher than I expected. After about 20 minutes of climbing, I came to a rocky outcrop with a partial view of the cabin below. From up there, I could see the roof clearly, the small clearing, even my fire pit. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. Whoever had left that print could have been watching the cabin from right here. I turned to leave and noticed something deeper in the woods. Another structure, half hidden behind thick trees, maybe 100 yards off. It was smaller than the cabin, built lower to the ground, with a sloped metal roof and dark wood siding. I hadn't seen it on any map, and Carl hadn't mentioned it. Something told me to turn around and walk back, but I didn't. I picked my way through the brush and got closer. The structure was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, more like a large shed than a cabin. It had no windows. The door was shut, and a thick chain hung from the latch, loosely looped but not locked. I hesitated. Then I grabbed the chain, slid it free, and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Mold, damp wood, and something else metallic. The inside was dark, but light filtered in through cracks in the siding. I could see a crude wooden table, stained in places, and some kind of chair with restraints bolted to the arms. There were dark streaks on the floor and scraps of fabric in one corner. My body turned cold. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I backed out, closed the door, and walked quickly, almost ran, back to the cabin. Once inside, I sat on the cot and just stared at the wall. My heart wouldn't slow down. I felt like I'd just stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. That shed wasn't a hunting blind or storage space. It looked like someone had built it for something bad. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the stove burning and sat with the lantern lit, listening. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, soft footsteps. Maybe, but when I opened the window, there was nothing. The forest stared back at me like it didn't care what happened here. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag, double-checked the place, and started down the trail toward my car. That's when I noticed it. My car door was open. I froze halfway down the hill, staring. The driver's side door hung open like someone had been inside. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I started moving again, faster now. When I reached the car, I saw the glove box had been opened, and the back seat was disturbed. My extra bag, the one I'd left with spare clothes, was gone. That confirmed everything. Someone had been watching me. Someone had come down from that hill, maybe while I slept, maybe while I was away from the cabin. They'd seen my car, searched it, and taken something. I got in, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove nonstop until I reached Sandpoint, the closest town. I pulled into a gas station, locked the doors, and sat there with the engine running until I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't call the police. I didn't report the shed. I didn't email Carl. I just left. I've never been able to explain what I found up there. Maybe it was an old interrogation site, some abandoned backwoods cult thing, or the work of a sick person who liked hurting things. I don't know. I don't want to know. All I do know is that I wasn't alone up there, and whatever I walked into, it wasn't meant to be found. My name is Travis Malone. I'm 33 now, but this happened in the fall of 2017, when I was 25. I had just quit my job in Denver. I'd worked construction for 6 years, and one day I just couldn't take it anymore. My foreman was riding us into the ground, my back was getting worse, and I barely had time to breathe. So I handed in my vest and walked off a highway project just south of Lakewood. Felt good for about 5 minutes. Then I realized I didn't know what the hell I was going to do with myself. My cousin Mason had a small farm cabin out in Nebraska. He'd bought the land cheap, maybe 10 or 15 years back, and fixed the place up himself. It was about 25 miles south of Hastings. It wasn't a working farm anymore. Just old barns, rusted fencing, and overgrown fields. Mason lived in Kansas City now, so the land just sat there. When I called him and asked if I could crash there for a while and clear my head, he said sure, just don't burn the place down. I drove out 2 days later in my beat-up Tacoma with a cooler, a few tools, a shotgun I kept behind the seat, and my dog, Ranger. He was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, mixed-eyed, raised from a pup. He had a scar across his back left leg from a barbed wire fence back in Colorado. But other than that, he was healthy, quiet, and smart. Good dog, real loyal. The cabin was old but solid. It had been a farmhouse once, probably 100 years ago. It sat at the end of a long dirt road with cornfields on both sides, though the stalks were dried and dead now. The harvest was already done for the season. The nearest neighbor was maybe a mile away, through a line of trees and across a field that looked like it hadn't been worked in years. The cabin had no internet and barely any cell service. There was electricity from a line that came through the trees and well water. That was enough for me. I settled in that first day, unpacked my stuff, swept the cabin, and aired out the back room. It had a musky smell, like mildew and mouse droppings, but nothing unbearable. I didn't have much on my schedule. Mostly I wanted to be alone, get my head right, maybe write a little, maybe fix up the place. I went for walks with Ranger and chopped some deadfall wood. I cleaned up the porch, which had collapsed on one side, and patched up a broken window. It felt good to use my hands on something that didn't have a deadline. The second week, I noticed something strange in the back field. There was an old shed maybe 70 yards behind the cabin. It had a slanted roof and rusted tin siding. I hadn't bothered with it yet. There were burrs and dead weeds around the door, and the hinges were rusted shut. But one morning I saw it wide open. I was drinking coffee on the porch when Ranger perked up and stared toward the field. I followed his gaze. The shed door was open, just hanging there. The wind was light that day, barely moving the tall grass, but the door creaked softly as it shifted. I was sure I hadn't opened it. I walked out with Ranger beside me, kicking through the weeds. Inside the shed was nothing but some broken tools, an old oil drum, and what looked like the frame of a kid's bike. I looked around for signs of animals, maybe a raccoon or something, but saw nothing.
No paw prints.
No signs of digging. I figured the wind must have finally broken the latch loose. So I shut the door, found a chunk of wood nearby, and wedged it up against the bottom. That seemed to hold it. That night, I didn't sleep well. Ranger kept pacing the cabin. He wasn't barking or growling, just walking back and forth from the front door to the back window. I heard his nails clicking on the floorboards. Around 3 a.m., he sat at the back door and stared through the glass, ears up. I turned on the porch light and stepped out barefoot with the shotgun in my hand. I didn't see anything. Just the backyard, the shed in the distance, and some moonlight on the tall grass. I stood there for a while, listening. It was completely quiet. No wind.
No bugs.
Just stillness. Next morning, I went to the shed again. The wedge of wood was still there. Door was still shut. I went about my day, did some patchwork on the chimney, cut some more wood, and swept the attic. I tried not to think about how quiet the land had felt the night before. I'd grown up around fields and woods. I knew how they were supposed to sound, but that stillness, no insects, no owls, felt wrong. That evening, I grilled some sausages out back and ate with Ranger beside me. I had a beer and watched the sun go down. It was peaceful for a while. Then, around 9:30 p.m., I heard something. It was soft, faint, but I know what I heard. It was metal scraping on metal, like the shed door dragging against the hinges. I stood up and looked toward the field. Couldn't see much, it was already dark. I walked inside and grabbed my flashlight. When I stepped out and swept the beam across the field, the shed door was open again. This time, the wedge I'd put against it was gone. Not pushed aside. Gone. I walked out there with Ranger on my left and the light in my right hand. Inside the shed, the stuff was just like before, broken tools, a bike frame, old trash. But the wedge of wood was nowhere. I looked around for tracks. Nothing. Dry grass, undisturbed. I shut the door again, but this time I dragged an old metal plowshare from the side of the field and leaned it heavy against the bottom. That night, I brought Ranger's dog Bed into the bedroom and left the window open a crack for air. I lay in bed with the shotgun leaning against the wall just in case. Around midnight, Ranger growled low in his throat. It was the kind of growl he only gave when he really didn't like something. I sat up. He was staring at the window. I stepped out of bed and looked. In the moonlight, out by the shed, the door was open again. The metal plowshare was gone. This time I didn't go out there. I shut the window and pulled the shade. The next morning, I found the plowshare 30 feet away, dropped at the edge of the field like someone had picked it up and carried it before losing interest. It hadn't rolled. It hadn't fallen. It was lifted. That shook me up more than I wanted to admit. I tried to be logical about it. Maybe a kid from a neighboring farm was sneaking around. Maybe someone hunting coyotes or messing with old barns had seen the cabin and thought it was empty. I was a stranger around here. Maybe someone didn't like that. So I started keeping my shotgun loaded and stayed closer to the house after dark. A few nights later, it rained hard. The wind howled against the windows, and the whole cabin creaked. I stayed inside, reading an old book by oil lamp because the power had flickered out around 9 p.m. Ranger wouldn't leave my side. Around 1 a.m., there was a sharp thud against the back wall of the cabin. Not the roof, not a branch falling. It was like someone hit the wall with a sledgehammer just once. Ranger stood up and started barking like I'd never heard before. Full teeth, full body, tail down. I grabbed the shotgun and the flashlight, ran to the back door and swung it open. Rain blew in sideways. The wind was ripping through the grass. I stepped onto the porch and shined the light toward the field. There was someone standing near the shed, just standing. I couldn't see details, just the shape, broad shoulders, tall, long arms. They weren't holding anything. They weren't moving. I aimed the light right at them. They turned and walked straight into the shed and out of sight. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in a chair by the front door, shotgun across my lap, waiting for the sky to get light again. Ranger didn't relax either. He sat next to the window with his ears twitching at every little noise. When the sun came up, I walked out there with the shotgun ready.
No footprints.
No tire tracks. The shed door was wide open again, and the inside looked exactly the same. I didn't understand how someone could walk across a soaked field in that storm and not leave a single mark. That morning, I packed up my things. I put my tools, cooler, and shotgun in the truck. I loaded up Ranger, but before I left, I walked to the shed one last time. I found something new inside. It was a pair of boots, old, dry, cracked leather boots, lined up neatly just inside the doorway, facing out. I hadn't seen them before. They were size 13 or 14, way bigger than mine. I stood there for a while, staring at them. Then I backed out of the shed, shut the door, and drove away. I never went back to that cabin. Mason sold the property 2 years later to a guy who wanted to plant soybeans. I told Mason something about coyotes or vandalism. I didn't go into detail. I still don't know who or what was out there with me. But every time I think about that field, I see the open door, the missing wedge, the plowshare, and that silent figure standing in the storm, tall, still, and watching. And I still wonder how those boots got there. It was September 2009 when I decided to take a break from work. I was 34, burned out from the city, and needed a place to think. I didn't want a resort or a crowded park. I wanted somewhere far off, alone, quiet, disconnected. One of my coworkers had a cousin with a hunting cabin in southern Utah. The place was near nothing. The guy barely used it anymore and let me stay for free as long as I left it clean. The cabin was a few miles off a dirt road near a place called Escalante, though even that was more of a name than a town. No cell signal.
No neighbors.
No power besides a small gas generator. One room, a shed nearby. The area around it was mostly shrubs, dry grass, rocky hills, and patches of woods. The closest real road was 5 or 6 miles back. The cabin sat at the edge of a dried creek bed, with a view of the canyon stretching out below. It was beautiful but rough. I didn't mind that. I brought food, water, a lantern, and a shotgun. Not because I was expecting trouble, just because it felt right being that far out. I was planning to stay a week. No internet, no phone, just reading, hiking, thinking. When I first arrived, the place looked worn but intact. No obvious damage, just dust and cobwebs from being unused. The first 2 days were calm. I spent the mornings on long walks and came back in the afternoons to make simple meals on a small gas stove. I'd brought a few books and an old notebook to write in. At night, it was quiet except for the sound of bugs and coyotes calling from somewhere down the valley. But late on the third night, I started hearing something I couldn't figure out. It was around 1 or 2 a.m., and I couldn't sleep. It wasn't nerves. I was actually feeling more relaxed than I had in months. I had the lantern turned low and was just staring at the ceiling from the cot. That's when I heard a faint noise outside. Not animals, not wind. It sounded like walking, slow, careful steps, crunch of dead grass and grit. Paused. Then a few more. It wasn't close, not right at the cabin, but it wasn't far off either. I sat up and turned off the lantern. I waited and listened. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a cow from some nearby ranch. But the steps sounded too deliberate, like they were testing their footing. I stayed still for a long time. The steps didn't come closer, but every few minutes I'd hear them again. Soft, spaced out, circling at a distance. After maybe half an hour, they stopped. I didn't hear anything else after that. Eventually, I fell asleep again. Next morning, I checked outside. I didn't find tracks, but the ground was mostly hard and dry, with rocks and patchy dirt. Even my own footprints from the day before had already faded. Still, something felt off. I went a little farther out, 50 yards in each direction, but I didn't see anything unusual. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer after all, maybe more than one. I pushed the thought aside and went on with my day. That evening, I stayed closer to the cabin. I cooked dinner early and sat out front watching the sunset. It was quiet again like before. Around 9, I went inside, turned off the generator, and lit the lantern. I went to bed around 11. At some point after midnight, I woke up again. This time I didn't hear anything right away. What woke me was the feeling that something had. You know that feeling you get when you're not sure if a sound came from your dream or the real world? That's what it was like. I stayed still for a few minutes, just listening. Then I heard a soft knock. Not on the door, on the far wall, the one that faced the canyon. One knock, then nothing. Then, after 10 seconds, 2 more. Not loud, not like someone banging, but just enough to freeze me where I was. It didn't come again after that. I waited, 20 minutes, then maybe an hour. Nothing. I didn't move the whole time. I just stared at the wall. I had the shotgun leaned next to the cot, but I didn't reach for it. I don't know why. Something about the silence made me feel like if I made a sound, whatever it was might come back. When the sun came up, I finally got up and checked the outside. Nothing on the wall. No footprints. No scratches. No signs of anything. I started to feel like I was going crazy, like maybe I was imagining all of it. But that didn't feel right either. I knew what I'd heard. That afternoon I walked a few miles in each direction, trying to spot signs of anyone. Tire tracks, boot prints, wrappers, anything. I found nothing, just empty dry land. I didn't see anyone all day. That night I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern on. I stayed sitting on the cot, shotgun in my lap. Nothing happened. The fifth day is when I saw the person. It was late afternoon. I'd just come back from a short hike, maybe a mile north of the cabin, and I was walking back down a dry ridge that curved behind it. The path gave me a partial view of the roof before anything else. And just as I was coming around a bend, I saw someone crouched next to the back of the cabin. I froze. They weren't doing anything, just crouched low, like they were looking at the wall or doing something with the ground. I stayed where I was, maybe 50 yards away and uphill, and watched. They were barefoot, pale skin, no shirt. Pants looked dark, maybe black or brown, torn at the bottom. From the build, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. The hair looked dirty and matted, maybe shoulder length. They were thin, real thin, too thin. I waited, crouched low behind a bush, not moving. I was downwind, I think, because they didn't notice me. After a minute, they slowly stood up and walked away from the cabin. Not toward the road, not down the hill, just off into the woods to the northeast, where the brush was thicker. I waited until I couldn't see them anymore. Then I went back to the cabin and locked the door. I didn't unpack anything. I didn't cook. I didn't even turn the generator on. I just sat with my back to the door and waited. That night I heard them again. This time it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, low, heavy breathing, like someone standing close to the wall outside, just out of sight. Not moving, just breathing. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. At one point, something touched the front door handle. Not jiggling it, just touching it, like testing the weight. Then a soft scratch against the wood. By morning, it was gone. I packed up fast, shoved everything in the back of my 4Runner. I was about to leave when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There were small piles of rocks placed around the cabin. Not big, just stacked maybe 4 or 5 stones high. One in front of the door, one near the shed, one on top of the firewood pile, all evenly spaced. I didn't make those. No one had been out there with me. I didn't hear anything after that scratch at the door. I kicked over the rocks and left. I didn't stop until I hit pavement 30 miles later. I didn't call the guy who owned the cabin. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. But 2 weeks later, out of some dumb curiosity, I looked up disappearances in that part of Utah. Not recent ones, old ones. There were a few. A hiker in 1997, a hunter in 1984, a kid who went missing in the late 60s. They were all in the same general region. I still don't know what I saw. I don't think it was a ghost. I don't believe in that. And it wasn't an animal either. I've heard people throw around the word skinwalker to explain things like that. Someone who pretends to be something else. Something not quite human. But the thing I saw was just that. A person. A sick, thin, dangerous person. Someone who knew how to stay hidden. Someone who had probably lived out there a long time. Maybe even in the canyon. Maybe in a cave. Maybe they watched that cabin for years. Maybe they watched anyone who came. All I know is I never went back. And I never will. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 34 back then, working as a freelance web designer in Manchester. That month had been hard. I'd lost a big contract, had some issues with my landlord, and my sleep was all over the place. I wasn't depressed, just burned out. I needed to get away from the screen, the phone, the emails, everything. I found a small cabin online, listed by some old couple who barely knew how to use a website. It was deep in the Norfolk countryside, right by a place called Stalham, near the Broads. The listing said it used to be an angler's lodge back in the 60s, sitting just off a quiet road, next to a fawn, one of those boggy, flat marshes the East is full of. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no phone service. That's what sold it for me. I booked it for 2 weeks. Drove down in my old Vauxhall Astra, packed light. Just clothes, food, my books, and a little axe I kept in the boot. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Just my younger brother, Craig. He didn't really care. Just said to text him when I got back. The drive took longer than expected. Country lanes, muddy potholes, and an unexpected detour thanks to roadworks stretched the trip. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon. The sky was already gray, low clouds smudging the fields. The cabin was about half a mile from the main road. You parked by a wooden gate and had to walk the rest of the way. The path was narrow, muddy, and full of wet leaves. When I got to the cabin, it was quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in a park, but the full, empty kind where even birds don't seem to be around. The place itself was more like a wooden shed than a full cabin. Moss-covered roof, cracked windows, one door. Inside was basic. A small bed, a gas heater, a wooden table, and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in 10 years. But it was dry, clean, and just isolated enough to make me feel like I'd done the right thing. That first night, I sat by the window reading until the sun went down. I didn't bother with the heater yet, just wrapped up in my jacket. The fawn outside stretched far, almost like a flat sea of grass and black water, broken up by clusters of reeds. Even with the windows shut, I could smell the wet earth. I heard a sound outside sometime around 10. Not loud, just the faintest crunch of leaves. I froze, looked out the window. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint shapes of grass moving in the wind. Probably a rabbit or a fox. The next morning was cold. I made instant coffee with water boiled on the stove. My phone had no signal, and that was fine. I wrote in a notebook for a bit, then walked along the edge of the fawn. The air was sharp and damp, the kind that bites into your bones. There was a thin mist sitting over the grass, and my boots kept sinking into soft ground. I found a small trail that looped around the marsh and took it slow. No houses in sight, just the occasional old fence, fallen over from years of wind. I didn't see the woman until the third day. It had rained the night before, and the ground outside was thick with mud. I went for another walk, this time a little farther, closer to an old brick pump house I'd spotted from the window. When I got back, just before noon, there were footprints in the mud outside the cabin. Not mine, not animal, human. They were smaller than mine, barefoot. The toes were pressed deep into the mud, and I could see the shape of the arch and heel perfectly. They weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old, but they were clear. They came from the fawn, walked past the window, and then back into the grass. I stood there staring at them for a while, then walked around the cabin to check the rest. No other signs. The door was locked, windows closed, nothing missing. I told myself maybe it was a local kid messing about. Still, I slept lighter that night. I kept the axe beside the bed. The next few days were quiet, windy, the kind of wind that sounds like it's whispering through cracks. I started noticing things, though. Small things. I'd leave the cabin for an hour and come back to find the door slightly ajar, even though I knew I'd closed it. One morning, I found a pile of dead reeds arranged on the windowsill outside, like someone had placed them there gently. I tried to shrug it off. I even told myself I'd maybe done it myself and forgotten. My head wasn't exactly in a great place before the trip, after all. But on the 7th night, I woke up to a sound that I'll never forget. It was about 2 in the morning. I'd been in a light sleep, one of those half-dreaming states. What woke me was a noise that didn't fit. Something wet, slapping lightly against wood, like bare feet walking slowly across the porch outside. I stayed completely still. There was no wind, no other sound, just that slow, dragging slap. Then it stopped. Silence again. I didn't move for an hour. I kept staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. I didn't have curtains, so the moonlight cast long shadows across the wooden walls. I didn't sleep again until the sun started to come up. When I finally got the nerve to check outside, there were more footprints in the mud. Same size, same shape. This time, they led all the way to the door. Just stopped there. No one was around. I checked every direction. Nothing but reeds and wet grass. I started considering cutting the trip short, but I didn't. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to go back to the city yet. The idea of work, of bills, of routine, I just wasn't ready. I paid for 2 weeks. I told myself I'd finish it. That next night, I locked the door with the bolt and pushed the small table against it. I kept the axe right beside me and hardly slept. No noise that night, but the following morning, there were scratch marks on the outside of the door, just below the handle. Long, thin ones like from fingernails. It rained again that afternoon. I stayed inside. Every so often I'd hear something in the distance. Soft splashes, maybe a bird, maybe not. On the 9th day, I walked toward the pump house. It sat about a quarter mile from the cabin, low and crumbling, half swallowed by reeds. I wanted to see if maybe someone had been staying around there. I don't know why. I just needed some logic to cling to. The door was rusted shut. Inside, through a crack, I saw a pile of old metal parts and what looked like a burned mattress. I walked around the side and froze. There were more reeds arranged in a strange way, bundled, twisted, and laid out in a circle on the ground. In the middle, something small, white, round. I stepped closer. It was a doll's head, old, dirty, with one glass eye missing. The plastic was melted on one side. Someone had placed it carefully, like it meant something. I didn't touch it. I turned and walked back to the cabin fast, heart racing. Every few steps, I kept looking back. That night, I blocked the door again. I didn't read, didn't eat. I just sat on the bed, axe in hand, waiting. Around 1 in the morning, the cabin creaked. Not from wind, from weight, like someone had stepped onto the porch again. I held my breath. Then came the sound, bare feet again, slow, dragging. I looked toward the door. The light from the moon was faint, but I saw the shadow move across the crack under the door. A foot, then another. It stopped right outside. Then I heard breathing, slow, wet through the wood. It stayed for maybe a full minute. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then it left. Next morning, I found no footprints. The ground was dry. I couldn't explain it. I packed that day. I didn't even stay the last few days. I left the key on the table, took my bag, and walked to the car without looking back. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone much. Craig thought I just got bored and came back early. I didn't argue. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the owner of the cabin. Just a printed note with my deposit refund. At the bottom, in a shaky pen, was a handwritten line. Hope she didn't bother you too much. Most people don't make it the full stay. I never went back. And every so often, when I hear the wind rattle outside my flat, I think of that woman, whoever she was. Not a ghost, not a monster, just someone real, out there in the marsh, watching, waiting. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take some time off work. I was 32, working a job that was burning me out in Detroit. Long hours, no recognition, just the kind of grind that wears you down in small, quiet ways. I needed space. a break from screens, phones, traffic, meetings. So I planned a solo trip into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I booked a small off-the-grid cabin just outside a town called Eckerman, a place I'd never even heard of before. I didn't go looking for anything fancy, just a roof over my head, a place to fish, hike, maybe shoot my .22 at some cans. I packed some food, my old Remington rifle, a thick sleeping bag, and headed north. The drive up took about 7 hours. As I left the main highways behind and got deeper into the woods, I felt the stress peel off my shoulders. Trees pressed in on either side of the 2-lane road. The last bit was a dirt trail, rutted and muddy, the kind you'd hesitate to drive down without 4-wheel drive. The cabin wasn't on Google Maps. I had to follow printed directions the owner emailed me. That should have been the first red flag. The cabin sat on a rise in a clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It was rough, real backwoods stuff. Unpainted boards, tin roof, a stone chimney leaning a little off-center. No power, no running water. There was a hand pump well out back and an outhouse about 30 yards from the front door. But I didn't care. That was the whole point. What I didn't expect, what the owner didn't mention, was the graveyard. Behind the cabin, through a patch of trees and tall grass, there was an old iron fence mostly fallen over and choked with vines. Inside it were maybe 15 or 20 headstones, small, weather-worn, leaning in different directions like broken teeth. Some were sunken into the ground so deep that only the tops of the stones showed. It looked like no one had been buried there in decades, maybe 100 years or more. The dates, when I wiped the moss off, were from the late 1800s to early 1900s. Most of the names were German. Lots of Schmidt and Baumann. Creeped me out, sure. But I told myself it was just history, probably a family plot. Back then, people buried their kin wherever they lived. I figured, so long as I left it alone, it would leave me alone. That first night was quiet. I made a fire in the stone fireplace, ate a can of chili, and played solitaire with a flashlight on the table. The cabin creaked a lot, wood swelling and shrinking with the cold night air. I chalked it up to age. Around midnight, I turned in, sleeping with the rifle close, more out of habit than fear. The second day, I hiked around the woods, got a feel for the area. There was an old deer trail that ran past a half-collapsed barn a quarter-mile from the cabin. Found some bear scat near it, old and dry. I didn't go too far, just enough to burn off some nervous energy. That evening, I was sitting out front on a stump, sipping coffee from a dented thermos, when I noticed something that I hadn't seen the day before. A narrow path behind the graveyard, more like a strip of dirt where grass refused to grow, led deeper into the woods. It was barely wide enough for a person. I followed it maybe 50 yards before I stopped. It gave me a bad feeling. Just a bunch of young birch trees on either side, but they grew so close together that it felt like being swallowed. I turned around and went back. That night, something woke me. It was a dull thud, like something heavy dropping on the porch, then quiet. I sat up, holding my breath. Another thud, then silence. I stayed still, straining my ears. Nothing. I flicked on my flashlight and moved toward the window. Nothing on the porch. No tracks in the dirt either. But I noticed something odd near the edge of the graveyard. One of the stones had fallen over. I tried to ignore it. Rocks fall. Time passes. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well after that. On the third day, I walked the perimeter of the graveyard. I noticed that the iron fence had fresh scrapes on it, bare metal showing through the rust. I figured maybe a deer rubbed against it or a bear, but the height was all wrong. Whatever scraped it must have been human-sized. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, I started keeping the rifle loaded from then on. That afternoon, I heard a sound out by the trees past the graveyard. It wasn't an animal sound. It was a sharp, short clink, like metal on metal. I grabbed the rifle and walked slowly toward the fence. I didn't see anyone, But as I looked out past the grave markers, I saw something half buried in the dirt about 10 feet into the woods. I brushed it off with my boot. It was an old crowbar, rusty but still solid. I didn't like how it felt in my hand. It was cold, even though the sun was out. I left it where I found it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woods were too quiet. Around 2 a.m., I heard shuffling. This time, it was right behind the cabin. I froze. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against my chest. I eased up, grabbed the rifle, and peeked through the corner of the back window. There was nothing there, but the door to the outhouse was swinging open. I know for a fact I shut that door earlier that day. It doesn't swing easy either, it drags along the dirt when it moves. I watched it creak slowly back and forth for several minutes. Then, just before it swung shut again, I thought I saw a boot in the doorway. Not a whole person, just part of one. As if someone was standing just inside, keeping still. I stayed up till dawn, rifle in my lap. The next morning I checked the outhouse. Nothing inside, but on the dirt floor was a single deep boot print. Not mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots. This one was smaller, narrower, maybe a size 9. I had no neighbors out there. No one should have been around. I was too far off the main roads. I stood out in the clearing, turning slowly, scanning the trees. I had the rifle pointed down but ready. That day, I packed most of my food into the cooler and brought it into the cabin. I kept the rifle beside me at all times, even inside. I didn't go out to hike. I didn't sit on the porch. I waited. That evening, something moved behind the trees. I didn't see it full on, just a flash of motion in the corner of my eye, a shape slipping behind a trunk. I watched the woods until dark, but nothing came out. I nailed a blanket over the cabin window and bolted the door. That night, I barely slept. In the early hours of the morning, I heard footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate. Hail tutu. I held my breath and stared up at the dark wooden beams above my bed, listening. There were 4 or 5 steps, then silence. Then a sound like a board creaking under weight. Then nothing. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed fast, threw everything into the back of the truck, skipping breakfast, skipping coffee. I just wanted out. I made one last sweep to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. That's when I saw the grave marker again. The one that had fallen over 2 nights before. It was standing upright now, clean, like someone had wiped it off. And on top of the headstone sat the rusty crowbar. I didn't go closer. I got in the truck and backed out fast, tires throwing up dust. I didn't look back. When I got home, I called the cabin owner's number. It rang once and went to voicemail. Emailed. No response. I checked the listing a few days later. It was gone. Just disappeared. A week after I got back, I went through my phone. I hadn't taken many pictures, just a few of the woods and the front of the cabin. But when I looked closely at one photo, taken on my second day, my stomach dropped. In the background, deep in the shadow of the trees, there was a figure, very faint, but there. It looked like a man, standing motionless behind the fence. His head tilted slightly to the side, not facing the camera, just watching the cabin. I zoomed in until the image blurred into pixels. The hair on my arms stood straight up. I deleted the photo. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't want to hear the usual, "You were just paranoid?" Or, "It was probably a hunter." I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Someone was out there. Someone who didn't want me there. Someone who didn't speak, didn't knock, didn't run. Just watched. Just waited. I haven't been back to the Upper Peninsula since. Now, sometimes when I lie in bed at night, I swear I hear the creak of a roof board or a soft thud on the porch. I sit up, heart pounding, rifle nearby, but it's always nothing. I hope,